Um, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome Alexia Yates to give today's lecture, which is entitled Selling Paris, which is part of our thematic seminar series this semester entitled Architectures of Speculation, where we're considering architecture's historical and contemporary relationship to real estate speculation. Last week we heard on post-war Rome, and today we'll hear on fin-de-siècle Paris and its associated urban developments. And then in the coming weeks, we will discuss land ownership issues, spatial ordering of property, and buildings as financial instruments. Alexia Yates is a senior lecturer in modern history at the University of Manchester, which was in the news yesterday, I should maybe add, where she researches urban history and the history of economic life in Europe. When we were looking to develop this series, we could not have Paris be included in this story, especially Paris at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And we came across her book, Selling Paris, Property and Commercial Culture in Fin-de-siècle Capital, which traces the emergence of commercial Parisian housing market as private property owners, architects, speculative developers, and land credit leading institutions combined to finance to combine financing, building, and selling of apartments and buildings. For any scholar, as we were just talking, once the book is finished, maybe the book itself and its immediate content tends to be put to rest, but not necessarily the broader ideas. And we really want to thank Alexia for going back to this project, expanding it, maybe using this even as an opportunity to rethink the set of ideas that were outlined in another manner with a fresh perspective. Alexia has obtained her PhD from the University of Chicago, and she previously held a postdoc fellowships at Harvard and at the University of Cambridge. I should add that in the lecture today, we will be focusing really on the transformative effects of the building boom and bust in Paris, starting really in the 1880s, and how this has affected both the built landscape and the market life of its properties. So what are really the financial mechanisms that are attached to the real things of buildings? So let's say there's the abstraction of market life, and then there's the reality of building life and landscape. So at any rate, I give the floor to you, and we wish that we would be meeting you in person, and there will be another moment, but thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I know that it came at a moment of transition from one country to the next, and now you're back in Manchester. So it's great to at least see and meet you on Zoom, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I have been watching the series so far. I love that they've been recorded and they're available. And I plan to keep watching the end. So, I've been on this journey along with everyone who is in this room. I've been learning quite a bit, and also, have been just really impressed by everyone's engagement with this topic, which it's true. I started working on this project many, many years ago, and I've published on it a few years back, and I continue to work on it, but is, one of my intellectual loves. So this is just great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about these things today, and to try to put them in a broader context, and to think about the things that I did some years back in terms of work that is still ongoing, and thinking just sort of like bigger and broader about what it is to think about real estate historically. So I'll start with a few of the principles or a few of the sort of guiding ideas that undergird how I think about real estate and why I think it's important to approach it in the way that I do. Real estate, as I said here, and I think if you had time to take a look at the material that I shared before this session, I approach real estate as a category with a history. Real estate is a historical category. In the reading that I shared, for instance, I give a longer history of how I think it is a distinct way of assembling land and capital that is imbued with a politics and a practices of dispossession and of acquisition that are fundamentally imperial. Bringing this historical perspective to real estate has the effect of denaturalizing it. We say that quite a lot as historians, and what we do is denaturalize things. So what that does in the case of real property, think about it as real estate, moves it, I hope, from a simple artifact of scarce land and market forces to present it instead as a category of contestation, as a tool, as a strategy of construction and reproduction of unequal power relationships. And I really do approach urban real estate in particular as serving as the city's political and economic infrastructure. This is a training ground in which people learn, historically, those in charge of municipal governments, learn how to govern a city. They learn it in terms of property management. Real estate, as I say here, and actually as I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about today, I'll be talking about sort of these imaginings of the city. It serves as a powerful mode of understanding, organizing, and imagining the city in the modern era. I think that what we sort of tend not to do so much, but what I try to do in my own work is to give attention to the urban imaginaries and the social spaces that real estate creates and that real estate can constitute. The creation of real estate markets, I think it's something that is so familiar to us today that we tend not to think about it as a historical concept. But its creation is a transformation, really, in ways of seeing urban land and buildings, and that profoundly reshapes the conditions of possibility for a city's development. Imagining cities in this way, in terms of real estate and in terms of real estate markets, makes certain spaces and modes of urban belonging possible, and it erases other modes. So there are things we can't see if we see through real estate, and that's purposive. And the final point I've put up here, restoring history as an interdisciplinary task. Thinking real estate historically is necessary, I think, not only outside the discipline of history. And of course, here I'm speaking as a historian to people who are not primarily historians. So I'm fascinated to hear, perhaps we'll hear some in the discussion, sort of what the utility of history is for those who are outside history and dealing with these issues. I have ideas about that, but I want to hear, other people's. But that's not only necessary outside discipline, it's also necessary inside the discipline. Our best studies of speculation today are rather shallow historically. They tend to, the people who are doing the best work on real estate speculation, who often, of course, are not in history, but do attempt to historicize what they do, tend to not be very deep. As I said, usually this is a story from the 1970s onwards. And history itself has not placed speculation in a critical lens. So I think, both outside of history and within history, we have work to do in being able to think real estate in this critical and historical sense. Now, if I can just move my train of people, I'll be able to somehow move my slide. Oh, here we go. The setting I'm going to be investigating today is Paris in the early Third Republic. And this is going to be sort of our landscape for thinking about these broader issues. The early Third Republic is the period from the 1870s to 1914. That's the period that I primarily study in my work. This follows a massive state-led renovation project known as Haussmannisation. And if one is a student of either the history of Paris or of urban planning and design, and you know anything about Paris, probably what you know is the process that has become known as Haussmannisation, this largely state-led, infrastructure-driven planning regime that characterized mid-century planning in 19th century Paris. So not only did the early Third Republic follow this massive urban renovation known as Haussmannisation, it also follows a period known as the Paris Commune. This is a period in which the meaning and the practice of municipal governance is being reimagined. So the Paris Commune was a municipal revolution, which was fundamentally in many ways about a new kind of municipal sort of like claims of citizens to space and representation. So there's a lot of sort of backstory happening that informs what goes on in Paris in the sort of 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. It's also a period in which most of the built landscape of the city that we know today was actually constructed. So this is a map of Paris's, the age of Paris's, this is of all of the buildings in Paris today as a contemporary one. But if I were to take out the other layers, we see that these are the buildings from 1850 to 1914. In fact, this constitutes very much of what we associate with the practice of contemporary Paris. The landscapes of contemporary Paris. So someone I'll be using today as one of the sort of stars of my book, who's an architect. He's trained as an architect at the École des Beaux-Arts. He becomes a speculative architect in the 1880s. His name is Paul Focchio. And we're going to be using some of his productions, both his built productions and his sort of more intellectual productions, as a way of looking at the role of the speculator in urban space. If we were to look at this particular period through his eyes, in mid-1881, we would find Paul Focchio in his Montmartre real estate company, which is the largest building site in the city in mid-1881. He's employing 300 workers. He's building 3 streets. He's putting up over 88 apartment buildings. A few streets away, his Clichy Lands company is putting in 2 new streets and 46 apartment buildings. The City Hall Real Estate Company, it's just 1 street in this instance and 8 new apartment buildings. This is right in the center of the city, very near the Mairie. If we turn over to the 8th arrondissement, so a slightly, a much more wealthy, but also still developing part of the city, his General Real Estate Company and his Parisian Real Estate Company are putting in dozens of new buildings. If we go again a little bit further to the west, the Villa Caprice Real Estate Company, in which he is an important operator, is constructing new streets and residences in the 16th arrondissement, which is the developing and very residential west end of the city. Between 1879 and 1882, he'll found between 1879 and 1882, he founds 12 different Sociétés Anonymes, or limited liability real estate development companies. And I'll describe the mechanisms of these companies in a little bit. Before his 30th birthday, so by 1885, he's responsible for the construction of hundreds of apartment buildings and private homes across the city. And these range from working class apartment buildings, which would be sort of like the ones in the Montmartre development up there in the north of the city, to these wealthier, sort of private homes, essentially what we call sort of little mansions today in the west end of the city. And I want to flag up, just in passing, one of his developments that I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I had to mention it because it struck me very much in looking at some of the other contributions to the series, the similarities between this development. I was watching in particular Florian Hertweck's lecture on the land question, and he starts with this, a development or a piece of sort of farming land in between, it looked like 2 highways. And he talked about the process by which this gets subdivided and resold and repackaged each time as sort of an increase in land value. And it immediately struck me that this, it sounded so similar to this particular development that Paul Focchio undertakes in collaboration with other architects in the 1880s in a working class district of the city of Paris. So in 1882, he collaborates with 2 other architect developers to purchase land that was being offered for sale by the city of Paris, and particularly by the city's welfare administration, which is called the Assistance Publique. So they have a domain that they manage. And this land was being sold for redevelopment. He's one of the buyers. They quickly repackage, they subdivide, open 3 new streets. You can see the development process is there on the left of the slide, sort of the development and sale process. They open 3 new streets. And they begin selling lots. Well, they're not selling lots. So what they're doing is they're renting lots with purchase options to buy. And again, I'll explain that mechanism in a little bit. But when they buy the land for approximately 80 francs a square meter, and they're selling purchase agreements for about 200 francs a square meter. So there's a tremendous opportunity for profit in this development. And at the time, as a result of this, it caused significant public controversy. Because public land, and not only any public land, this was, as I said, it was owned by the welfare administration. It was land that was intended to shepherd the sort of welfare of the city's poor. has been sold, and sort of this kind of tremendous opportunity for profit had passed directly into the hands of private developers. And there are sort of this occurs right in the middle of a sort of significant debate amongst municipal councillors themselves, as well as those who have a sharp eye for municipal affairs, about how the city should be developing and what the role of private development should be in the provision of the sorts of things that the city needs. So I raise this only in a way, slightly in a comparative way, and slightly similar to the way that, again, if you had the opportunity to read the documents that I provided, the way that I sort of start that story of real estate as a historical category by looking at a real estate boom in the 1880s and drawing comparisons to sort of the situation of 2007. There's a way that this development, as it struck me, sounds so similar to the type of not only the actual sort of practice of development, but also the controversies of development that surrounded the instance that sort of opened up that great lecture by Florian Hertweck. And so I offer it as an instance in which I think serves to highlight both the sort of the difficulties, I think, in historicizing what can often on the surface look to be very similar ongoing long-term practices. There are so many actual continuities and there are so many similarities. But what I hope to argue and hope to show in this is that we need to be attentive to the differences. And we need, importantly, to specify the material, the intellectual, the discursive work that is performed by development, and particularly speculative development, that we need to look beneath sort of some of these surface continuities. So some of the things that I look at when I look at an operation, the operations of someone like Foucault, are the sorts of things that we can really see these things, or I should say, quite distinctly if we look particularly at this building boom that I study, which really, I think, sort of concentrates and brings to the fore in a very sort of pronounced and visible way many of the tendencies that were transforming how real estate was operating as a commercial object in this particular period. So Foucault is one of the many architects who's involved in a particular building boom in the French capital in the late 1870s and the early 1880s. And their operations partook of numerous changes in the mechanisms of property production and distribution. As I said, the state-led development regime of the Second Empire is falling away and becoming reformulated under the early Third Republic. One of the ways of understanding how they begin treating real property differently is this category that is a category that they use, but that I use as well, which is the mobilization of real property. They articulate a new relationship between real estate and finance. And they do this in very material ways by facilitating the division of real property into transferable shares. That's what the limited liability corporation will help do. And you see an image here. I've simply chosen one from my archive of a share in a particular real estate development company in this period, as well as undertaking the production and turnover of physical structures. And the images that are on the right of the slide are of investment opportunities that begin sort of proliferating in this period. People buying shares in particular buildings. So not only in a company, for instance, or in a mortgage bond, but actually sort of buying collaboratively particular buildings and claiming kind of a fraction of the income of those buildings. So this is a process, as I said, they referred to at the time as mobilizing property, making it more like a financial asset. They do this via a professional and via and in concert with a professional and popular press that is engaging in new forms of narrating an object which is beginning to be called for the first time a real estate market. Specialized real estate brokerages are appearing that sought to integrate the purchase and the rental of real estate into the circuits of marketplace modernism and capital circulation, which is defining the experience of the modern metropolis. And I believe I included some of one of these journals as well, as to give you a sample of what some of these advertising texts from this period looked like. Because of these kinds of forces, this mobilization, this commercialization, residential property began to seem to contemporaries as increasingly implicated in the mechanisms of the mass market. And indeed, we can see in this next slide here, that this is an image of the real estate department of one particular grand magasin, or large department store in Paris. We often think of the Paris of the 19th century as being defined in significant part by these new kind of extravagant spaces of consumerism. The new department store, and the department stores themselves in this particular instance, also has a real estate department. And they published, the Grand Magasin du Fayel published a particular real estate guide. One of the surveys of the period, a national inquiry into the status of building and commerce, which took place after a market crash. The market crash I'll speak about in a moment, 1882, looked particularly at the building sector, in Paris to understand what was changing. And I've picked out this conclusion here to sort of dramatize this notion of sort of the novelty of this commercialization. The building sector is less industry than it is commerce. Transactions are constant, eradicating production in a manner of speaking. For the public at large, the building entrepreneur is a merchant, almost a broker, just like the head of a department store. Now, what I want to draw out is that for real property, for land and buildings, to come to be seen and to be treated as merchandise in a department store is no straightforward affair. It's no straightforward affair anywhere, and it certainly wasn't in 19th century France. And if we want to trace how real property could come to act like this, could come to act as a commercial object in the spaces of the city and in the portfolios of investors, we need to acknowledge these agents and their interventions. And we need to open up their business networks, their financial arrangements, their political and the social ambitions that structured their production. And of course, that also consequently structures the distribution and ultimately the consumption of Parisian real estate. That requires reading the familiar from small streets or large boulevards and these ordinary looking apartment buildings in unfamiliar ways, and adding new texts to our pantheon of urban texts. By that, I mean the publicity journals and advertising columns that I showed you a few slides back, the rental contracts of property owners, annual shareholder reports, the shares and bonds of limited liability corporations, and the scribbled surveys of municipal tax assessors. All of these are necessary to sort of get beneath the skin of what looks to us as sort of the ordinary built landscape. The payoff is not only a new account of the political and the economic stakes, as well as the social experience of city building during a crucial period of urbanization. It's also an account of real estate as a social product. This is, I think, how we get there, as a terrain of contestation. And I think that this restores contingency and it restores materiality to what is often glossed as the depersonalized workings of circuits of capital, right? This is supposed to be the kind of stuff that just happens automatically, but of course we know it doesn't. Now, the commerce in real estate provides many possible sort of avenues of investigation and different entry points to open up and to really kind of get inside this process. Today, what I want to talk about, as I indicated earlier, is to focus on the speculator and his role. And they are, of course, he's in this period as a purposive actor in urban land use decisions. And it's quite interesting. So the role of private development, private enterprise is everywhere in urban history, but its operations are more often assumed than analyzed. And there's numerous reasons for this neglect. And I was, some of what this quick list that I'm about to give will be quite familiar to you from the last presentation that you had on real estate development in Rome, which I think, hit quite a few very important points about why it's sometimes difficult for people, again, not only in history, but in several disciplines, to really take this kind of construction seriously. There's a persistent moral dubiousness attached to speculation. And that gets to this notion of sort of what the politics are of these people and who do we choose to study. We often don't choose to study people whose politics we don't admire, though of course we need to. The elusiveness of small-scale developers to historians in particular who depend on archives. It's often quite hard to get at a record of this kind of activity. The artifacts of speculative construction themselves, so the apartment buildings, the houses that make up what architectural historian Carolyn Loeb has referred to as an entrepreneurial vernacular. These were for a long time deemed unworthy of inquiry by contemporary architectural critics, and historians have perpetuated this disregard quite often, not always. And there's also, a sort of an appearance of timelessness, I think, of stasis, of tradition, that inheres in this kind of production of ordinariness or of everydayness, again, which sort of is not as attractive to historical inquiry. Historians are attracted to dramatic change, to rupture, to explaining transformations, and also explaining things that happen sort of quickly and fast. So if you're a historian of capitalism today, for instance, understanding sort of the world of the fast-paced world of finance seems more challenging and possibly has a greater payoff than trying to understand what is understood as sort of a slower, more durable form of profit making and of sort of the construction of space. So I think all of these reasons combine to explain why we don't always look to these spaces with the most critical eye. Nevertheless, how these builders operated, their perceptions of opportunity, their divinations of urban growth were fundamental forces in the making of the city. And they situated their enterprises within a specific urban imaginary, as well as within a particular understanding of the housing marketplace, which both motivated and explains some of their development practices. These notions constituted a common sense of development or a common knowledge. They granted collective shape to otherwise uncoordinated activities. Indeed, the translation of their knowledge practices, the knowledge practices of speculators and of developers, into a kind of common sense is perhaps one further reason or one further explanation for why their agency is sometimes obscured in the construction of modern cityscapes. It does seem to become common knowledge, but in fact, there's nothing common about it. So one of the few early researchers to take the role of speculators in urban development seriously is a French sociologist named Maurice Halbach. Provides a provocative formulation of the relationship between speculators and urban growth. He was an observer of the Chicago School of Sociology, but nevertheless, he maintained a critical distance from Burgess and Park. I think he did go to Chicago several times and work with them briefly. And he published important studies on the operations of the Parisian land market, particularly in 1909. The study I have here, his study of the expropriations of land in the city of Paris. And when he's writing in 1909, he's in fact writing right in the midst of another giant real estate boom. So I'll be talking about I'm talking about the 1880s today. We then get a period of depression. And then right before the war, there was another very significant market boom. So he's working on land in that context. And in these works, Halbach presents the city as an organic entity, which flows in accordance with deeply felt, if often confused, collective desires. The activities of municipal planners or individual speculators, far from imposing themselves unnaturally upon this movement, were rather the product of those needs themselves, and they served to typify, magnify, and expand them. So as he writes, far from interfering with the natural laws of development, speculators are themselves natural forces created by a specific society that itself could not exist without them. So to him, their particular role lay not in guiding urban development, but in cannily and in truth, just barely predicting it. So their interests grant them a position for which they could organize what appeared as chaos to less diligent observers. Ultimately, he insists, and this is the second part of the quote here, that their intervention concerns only means and details. It has never changed or obstructed the play of collective forces. So for him, I mean, they're important, they're very important. He's one of the only people that actually talks about them. But in fact, they come from below rather than imposing their own vision on the city. So I think he, if we go to the sort of next quote here, he goes perhaps too far in erasing the individual agency of developers, but in passages like these, he nevertheless points us to this vital work of interpretation for which they're responsible. So like he says, in a given period, the expanse of land with marketable value as prospective building areas can be said to be defined not by real needs, and these terms are going to keep coming back throughout the presentation, real needs, but by the idea that is formed about these needs and by their likely expansion in the future. So while on the one hand, he's telling us, the speculator is really, he's just a tiny step ahead. of what's actually going on in the real kind of organic forces of the city. This notion that the ideas being formed about needs are what's really helping, particularly in terms of determining development patterns, points to this really key role, I think, for the speculator. And as I said, I'll be focusing quite a bit on what follows here on this, especially on this work of interpretation. How is it that developers are going about the idea that is formed about these needs? So this building boom I keep referencing explodes in Paris in the late 1870s and the early 1880s. And it surpasses even the most flourishing moments of the famous renovations of the Second Empire. So the period from 1876 to 1885 saw nearly 2.5 billion francs of transactions in real property in the country as a whole. And most of that is in Paris, Paris and its surrounds. And you can see the peak that's right towards sort of the final third of this graph is the century's highest number of real estate transactions, which is in 1881. This building, excuse me, I should point out as well that I have a quote there on this from this municipal report on rents. In no other period have the fluctuations of constructions and demolition enacted such significant changes in the situation of landed property in such a short span of time. And you can already see that in the 1880s, I've already quoted a national government inquiry from 1884. This is a municipal inquiry trying to make sense of what's going on in land markets because of this massive upheaval. Building focused largely on residential construction, consisting of apartment buildings that filled their lots to the maximum permissible extent, and were composed disproportionately of apartments for the middle and upper classes. And this is to give you a sense of what this speculative housing package looks like, from Jonathan Rettiffin's Grand Journal Officiel des Locations de la Vente, des terrains immeubles. This is a very innovative real estate property marketing journal from the period. Jonathan Rettiffin is an important agency for developing this kind of new visual mode of rendering real estate. Now, looking around at this kind of development, the Parisian populace, as well as members of the municipal administration, regarded the changes in the city with mystification. Police commissioner reports from the period, particularly from the city's poorer quarters, reported on what they viewed as a situation which was uniquely unbalanced and inexplicably so. So, you can see police reports, for instance, reporting back on what's happening in terms of apartment turnovers in their areas and writing, how is it that rents can keep going up even though they're building so much? How can rents go up even though building is incessant? It is in strict contradiction with the laws of supply and demand. This impression of irrationality became even more evident when a stock market crash in 1882 revealed the building boom to be a bubble. Credit dries up, investors withdraw from the property market, and builders and developers confront the realities of overproduction. So here's a quote from the daily journal Le Temps in 1884, from the Trocadero to the Parc Monceau, and I believe the Parc Monceau has come up in a previous presentation as well. One can travel entire streets that are never disturbed by the footsteps of a single visitor. The monotony of endless perspectives, where the same building repeats itself in line, 50 examples on either side, is broken only by signs reading "for rent, water and gas" on all floors. Now, the commentary of informed observers was unanimous that this bubble, this was a failure overwhelmingly of business practice, not of the fundamentals of the Parisian market. So not of the city's demographics, for instance, or its more general economic situation, but of the activities of speculators themselves. It was held that they had acted unwisely, stimulated by easy credit available through an enhanced network of lending organizations. As one real estate journalist commented in 1884, and again, I have to quote up here, builders became true manufacturers, asking only to produce more, produce forever. They produced, and to employ an expression that describes the situation, they produced well in excess of the needs of the consumer. And I'll just point out that one of the reasons I so like this particular quote, not only does it have, it's got a great rhythm, asking only to produce more, produce forever, but also that the narrator of the market in this instance sort of trips over this notion and asks, if I could put it like this, they're essentially saying, they produce in excess of the needs of the consumer. The consumer is emphasized in the original, and they're almost apologizing for talking about real estate development in this way, right? That we're talking about in terms of consumerism. And I've put the plans up here of one architect named François Dauby, who is actually similar to Paul Fourcault in many ways. He's a speculative architect who founded during this boom at least 7 limited liability companies. And of course, I have an example of some of their company plans here to sort of illuminate that notion of the repetition, the producing more, producing forever, sort of these standardized floor plans and building facades. Journalists and commentators repeated concerns about the quality of information that was available to developers. So the construction weekly La Réforme du Bâtiment demanded that the city publish an accurate accounting of the housing requirements of each district of the city, a statistical survey that would, quote, inform speculators on the needs of the city's population, and so allow them to correctly orient their production. Similarly, when the daily newspaper Le Matin introduced a regular real estate column in 1885, it deplored the fact that if an architect, building entrepreneur, or property owner, and this is a quote, wants to learn the value of land in a given neighborhood, it is currently nearly impossible for them to do so. And they proposed that the city takes charge of producing an annual guide to the city's land values. So when municipality and the French state, in fact, eventually do produce such volumes towards the end of the century, they were greeted enthusiastically by this same community who really sort of called for more perfect renderings, more transparent renderings of the value of land in the city. So this is one from the 1891, well, the 1889 evaluation, which was published in 1891. The editors of the Construction Moderne greet these volumes with, the quote that I have up here is a real utility for architects insofar as they give precise information on the income level of residents of each neighborhood, and so help indicate how expensive a building one should reasonably build there. This assumption that perfect information would lead to an efficient and rational market was widespread, and developers themselves deployed numerous tactics in order to counter this perceived informational uncertainty. So in the midst of the boom, they're producing journals, gazettes, and guides that sought to establish a community of developers and to formalize networks of property exchange, making the market in land, buildings, and apartments visible and expanding its scope, naturalizing a particular vision of urban growth. So Fourcault himself, to sort of stick to our main narrator here, founded his Indicateur Général des Terrains et Immeubles à Vendre in 1877, which he described as a kind of real estate archive whose listings of sales, prices, and permit applications would provide all those interested with the means to understand the state of real estate. Of course, as a historian, I love this term that he describes it as a real estate archive, right? He's going to develop this kind of a memory for the real estate market from this publication. Alongside the summaries of real estate auctions and construction permit applications, which he had here, and sales advertisements as well, of course, the journal editorialized on the state of the field, presenting property development as an intellectual labor, as a rational practice distinct from a popular imagery of fevers. And of course, we talk a lot about building fevers, building booms today. In 1879, for instance, he penned an editorial which reminded readers that, quote, even the most experienced speculators reflect carefully before buying a piece of land, studying the pros and cons of the location of the neighborhoods, inquiring into the returns on neighboring buildings and the rental market. In short, they engage in serious work. Information networks were also cemented in the very nature, the very structure of the firms and the business form which dominated the boom. And this is to return to that form that I mentioned earlier, the limited liability corporation. And this is an image. If you look around Parisian streets today, very commonly, of course, you will find that the architect has signed the building that they have constructed, the architect or the entrepreneur, depending on how they identified themselves. And often enough as well, companies, as this one in the 20th arrondissement did, will also sort of tag their buildings as having been produced by them. So the limited liability corporation was a type of business organization which required cooperation amongst entrepreneurs. You needed to have a minimum of 7 people to form one of these. And along with the increasingly broadened network of credit institution, the companies themselves, which needed collaboration, and the lending networks, which I'll touch on again in a moment, multiplied and coordinated instances of informational exchange. So, they're developing newspapers, they're talking about the market, they're trying their own efforts to sort of render what's going on in the city much more transparent. Yet, these efforts fueled rather than deflated the bubble. And the imagined city of speculators departed substantially from the real city of Parisian residents. So the Société Anonyme, for instance, encouraged developers to focus on the upper end of the housing market at the expense of the mass of the Parisian populace. So, a mechanism that is about sharing information, sharing work, becomes one of the means by which some of that information can become distorted. The liberalization of this company occurred in 1867. And what that means is that from 1867, you no longer needed the government's permission, the government's authorization to form one of these companies. There were rules that you had to follow, it was regulated, but you didn't need to be authorized by the head of state. And this means that they became much easier to form and allowed developers to take advantage of an unprecedented advantage that the forum offered as a means of unifying capital and gathering associates. More than 250 such firms were founded in the capital city between 1870 and 1900 simply for the purposes of real estate development. 93 of these were founded just between 1880 and 1882. So this really is the kind of company form that dominates the construction that I'm talking about. And these arrangements allowed projects to begin with no more than the legal minimum of a quarter of capital paid in. So that means if you form a real estate company and you're saying, I'm $1 million real estate company, you only need $250,000. You only need to show that that's how much you have. And you can start with the expectation that you'll gather more money along the way. This, of course, means that quite a few ventures start really undercapitalized. Now, real estate development normally involves credit of some kind because it's something that requires the amalgamation of large groups of individuals in order to carry out substantial construction and also takes place over a considerable period of time. But the building boom of the late 1870s was more thoroughly reliant on debt than other booms were. And these are a new kind of debt arrangement. Developers deployed a new kind of purchase option, which was not widely used previously, which enabled them to borrow against land that they were merely renting. And this is called, here it is, to zoom in on this particular segment, the cession d'antériorité. Owners of land, what they essentially do by including a clause like this in their contract is they grant the developer who is merely renting their land the right to put a mortgage on it. They take themselves out of the privileged position that they have as owner of the land. In exchange for the risk that they run by doing that, they charge quite high prices to rent the land. And that, of course, contributes to the price of everything becoming far more expensive. These costs can further increase as developers will trade these these mortgage loan options, which often come with purchase options, amongst themselves. So, getting one will become the way that you can then go and form another company. You bring this in as your chief asset that you have permission to mortgage this important piece of land and ultimately to buy it. So as I said, and they're lucrative because on this basis, you can obtain lines of credit from a newly perfected system of property financing institutions. We won't spend much time on this. This is simply to give you a sense of sort of what the influx of credit to this building system looked like in this period. Two chief institutions that are summarized here, the Crédit Foncier, which is still around today, which is the nation's central mortgage bank, and a much more specialized institution, the Sous-Comptoir des Entrepreneurs. Both of these institutions, in fact, came out of the 1848 revolution. They're supposed to be, they're very political institutions intended to regulate and monitor the building industry. The Sous-Comptoir des Entrepreneurs lends primarily, will lend to a builder as they are constructing. Once you have a finished building, you convert that loan to a long-term mortgage with the Crédit Foncier. And this gives you a sense of sort of what we're talking about, the volume of the amount of money that's available in this period for developers. It's in the midst of this context, this particularly sort of explosive period of speculative development, that developers are formulating their own arguments about that frame, large-scale building, the type for which the Société Anonyme is most appropriate as the best and most rational style of building for the modern city. This is an argument that speculators make to the public through the gazettes that I pointed out earlier, for instance, but also to other architects. So architect and speculative developer named Onésime Masselin, for instance, published a guide to real estate development in 1880, which was essentially a manual for architects to familiarize them with the Société Anonyme form and to convince them of its utility. He argues that the Société Anonyme allows builders to obtain, subdivide, and develop large lots all at once, which not only reduces costs, but also speeds resale, as it, and this is a quote, eradicates the loss in value that is accrued when a new district is isolated, when shops are not present, or when temporary enclosures on empty lots give a bad impression. So with such positions, developers expanded the conceptual scale of their operations and their impact. And this is a scale that would match their boosterism, as these same publications presented Paris as an entity that was both destined for and reliant on continual growth. So Foucault's journal, for instance, was taken over by one of his colleagues and much enhanced, his colleague named Albert Laubière, explained construction patterns on the basis of Paris's unceasing growth as a center of global attraction. Developers willingly acknowledged that they were producing primarily for a clientele of wealthy buyers, investors, in fact, who would buy an entire apartment building, whose own priorities dictated production of habitations for the upper end of the market, because they were over time showing a decreased proclivity for managing working class buildings. Investors increasingly were disinclined to take on that kind of management. And this was borne out by my research as well. Those buildings buildings that are for the highest end of the market sell a lot more quickly. Nevertheless, by building more and building better, developers also argued that their constructions served the entire city, thanks to a conception of a housing market which they portrayed as continually filtering. And filtering, I think, is a concept, again, that we're familiar with today, and they're trying to sort of bring into being in this moment. So Albert Laubière remarks in an 1881 editorial that well-being has become general. He suggests that families displaced by demolitions will, quote, now look for their housing precisely in these new districts, which they'll seek out even more once they become well ventilated and find much more spacious apartments for the same price. So speculators and investors then are legitimizing their interventions in the city's built landscape by employing a naturalized image of the city as a magnet and placing their construction in the context of an ongoing evolution of consumer demand and of sort of the standard of living. Now, while developers most often spoke of a mobile urban population with steadily increasing demands for quality housing, critics of construction repeatedly invoked something they call the quote unquote needs of the neighborhood, the needs of the neighborhood. And you can flag back to what I sort of flagged up, as I said, sort of this notion of the real needs of an area. These are understood as the fixed demands of local environments, defined in demographic and material terms. Confronting streets of expensive and underpopulated apartment buildings, these lines and lines of the deserts of the Trocadero and the Parc Monceau, the popular and specialist press abounded with complaints that builders had, and I have a few here, constructed thoughtlessly without studying the aspects and needs of each neighborhood. Another complaint, they did not know how to adjust their constructions to the needs of the neighborhood, either in quantity or quality. Now, innovative graphical representations of Parisian construction, like the one that I have up here on the slide, this is composed by architect Paul Planet, who was the editor of the Construction Moderne. Though this is the actual version of these come from the Semaine des Constructeurs. So these are the two big journals tracking construction at the time. He composed these in 1884 to represent the disjuncture that occurred in the building boom between the production of developers and the movements of the population. So his first map maps kind of concentrations of construction, which he then pairs with this map of concentration of population growth to sort of show that there is a disjuncture between these two. He creates these statistical landscapes that reveal and insist on the diversion between the real city and these real needs, its geographies, its demographics, and the speculative city of developers. Now, the notion, I should say, that construction should be suited to the character of its neighborhood was in fact part of the common knowledge of developers. This is not news to them. In part of his series Analyzing a Market in 1882, for instance, Onesime Masselin had reminded young architects that the crucial question of the needs of the neighborhood was the key to any successful development. And this is one property guide from 1888, which says specifically tries to break the city of Paris down into numerous types of housing and types of neighborhood, and points out that your building has to be in harmony with its district. Now, however, the mechanism that developers were using to access these needs, right, to determine what the needs of a neighborhood were, was increasingly the price mechanism. In the eyes of developers, and this is articulated at the time, land takes its value from the revenues it can produce. That makes its price a transparent and a reliable indicator of its development potential. Expensive land was thus the preferred site for profitable development, as it indicated higher returns. Similarly, cheap land means low returns. In this view, you can never recoup from your investment by building on cheaper land. The notion being it essentially costs the same to build everywhere. If your building costs the same, then it's the price of land is the only difference. So they reply to critics saying, well, surely then if you build on cheap land, you're going to make more money. They say, no, the land is cheap because you can't make money there. And this is an article that, say, for instance, Laubière, again, he spells this out specifically in his journal, and he says, quote, compensation from cheap land doesn't exist. It's imaginary, it's a fallacy. And so this is part of how they're envisioning and therefore getting themselves into a particular kind of construction. Now, before 1870, if you bought a real estate guide to try to figure out what the price of land was, you wouldn't have been able to. Real estate guides offered advice on ideal investments. They provided overviews of legal matters concerning property development, but they did not include actual data on market activity. After this date, however, volumes frequently appeared, which consisted chiefly of real estate sales figures gathered from across the city. And here I should mention that the real estate agency, which I mentioned just very briefly earlier, the Jean Arthur and Tiffin real estate agency, they produce a land guide in the 1880s, which will in turn become a really important data source for Maurice Halbach's study of land values in the city. So real estate agents, real estate developers are really kind of part of the informational infrastructure of how people are understanding land development. The appearance of these compilations is important, I think, to understanding the market for property in the city. And I have an image just of sort of one of these that I was able to obtain from the latter part of the 19th century. On the face of it, these guides had a straightforward practical goal. They were providing the data necessary for determining the price of a piece of land through informed comparison. As guides to the entire city, they also proposed a spatial solution to the kind of disjuncture which we would have seen in that statistical landscape that Paul Planet tracked, right? They're constructing a unified development space from which a developer's local expertise might gain broader context and relevance, right? So someone who might only really know their own neighborhood could, through a volume like this, know about land much further afield. Yet the existence and the organizational form of these guides also had a more fundamental impact. In the pages of these new volumes, the incomparable, the specifics of a location, sort of the irregularity of a land parcel becomes comparable. Disparate transactions of dissimilar goods congeal into a market. Exchange appears constant, goods readily marketable, Price guides establish records of market activities. So they in fact extend, they kind of give a history to the market, give it a diachronic existence. And they reinforce an impression of property prices as relative rather than intrinsic. Right? Increasingly, it's that things are worth what you can compare them to and what they're next to, not anything specifically about the productivity of a particular piece of land. Finally, they also provide the information necessary to compose their readers into a calculative reader, calculative actor, which is the kind of actor a marketplace demands. So alongside the appearance of daily newspaper columns, tracking real estate transactions, and chronicling something called a real estate market, these kinds of guides brought a particular understanding of land and of real estate in the urban environment to a much broader audience. So what I'll do as I move toward a conclusion is to move somewhat away from this imagined world of real estate development, right? How developers see a city and see their own place and their own operations within it, to look a little bit more at some of the spaces. And you'll recognize this particular image. I think I provided again in advance some of Focio's plans. This is his Montmartre development in the north of the city in the early 1880s. So what I want to say is that the price mechanism provides a powerful but not omnipotent logic of speculative development. And here, by moving to sort of away from some of these ideas of these rationalizations, and the imaginings of speculative architects, I want us to look a little bit at their built production to see some of the complexity, some of the unpredictability of the speculative landscapes that they constructed. So Focio involved, I mentioned several of his plans already, and several of them are noteworthy for the ways that they consciously engaged with and capitalized on debates on the role of speculation in the urban economy. And the most significant of these, now I think he does this as well in the first development that I mentioned, but I think the most significant of these is his Montmartre development. And this is, as I said, he is working here on creating 3 new roads, constructing 88 apartment buildings, largely marketed as intended for working class apartment buildings. When completed, the development included 184 shops, over 3,000 apartments, destined for a modest class of tenant. With this project in particular, Focio courted the sensibilities of liberal housing reformers. Now, this is a network of individuals and organizations who were committed in this period to keeping the state out of the production of working class housing. The housing issue is from the 1850s onwards, really, but always taking on new political veins and new sort of contextual shadows. But it's really sort of the housing question is one of the most important sort of municipal questions of the period. And there are powerful interests who are committed to portraying any kind of state intervention in this area, be it municipal intervention, national intervention, as a kind of state socialism. So articles praising this project appeared in the Économiste Français and the Journal des Économistes, who were bastions of liberal economic thought that vaunted the buildings as exemplars of what the free market could achieve in terms of the provision of working class housing. The buildings themselves responded to reformers' perceptions of the desires of, let's say, the upper levels of the working classes for a middle class appearance in their housing. So the facades feature cut stone as opposed to, say, brick, or even sort of a lower grade building material, rough hewn stone. They have worked metal balconies, not all the way across the building, which would be a highest class of building, but there's at least one level of balcony which goes all the way across the facade of the building. The interiors proceed in a similar fashion. The salon appears occasionally. Most often the apartments do not feature them. And that is, of course, the room that is most central to a middle class, upper middle class idea of sociability. You have this separate sort of the salon for socializing, not only as a space of separation of sort of socializing with friends versus the private space of your family accommodation. So while they don't often have salons, though they do occasionally, there were some apartments that did, They did feature other really important features that liberal housing reformers really endorsed as sort of a way of ameliorating the living conditions of the working classes. So for instance, they separated the kitchens from a dining space. All apartments had individual washrooms as opposed to washrooms on the hallway, which would have been still extremely common at the time. And these, of course, are intended to mitigate the spatial promiscuity of working class housing. So with these designs and with his very public sort of, boostering of these designs, Foucault exploited the supposed goals of working class uplift that inhered in these buildings in order to gain concessions from municipal authorities who proved willing to finesse certain fiscal stipulations and concede some municipal land in light of what one of the evaluators of building permits for this project, one of the city's engineers, referred to as the, quote, material and moral advantages accruing to the city thanks to the new development. He also deployed their semi-bourgeois appearance to convince the administrators of the eventual buyer of this development, which is a property development company called the Rente Foncière, that the project would work for their shareholders. The Rente Foncière is a property management company founded in 1879, and to investors skittish of involvement with this class of building. I mentioned earlier that increasingly investors did not want to get involved in working class housing. The firm's directors were able to point out that this kind of building would clearly cater to an elite of the working class. And in fact, there's a really interesting discourse around how the only people who are going to live in these buildings are going to be quote unquote true Parisians, sort of not this mobile working class, but really, fixed, the sort of best tranche of the working class. Cognizant of the rising criticism of irrational real estate speculation during the boom, both Foucault and the Rente Foncière promoted this development as an example of how private enterprise responded to the quote-unquote real needs of the growing metropolis and, of course, these true Parisians. Now, ultimately, it was no more successful than the most critiqued luxury construction elsewhere. So these buildings were among the lowest performing buildings in the Rente Foncière's portfolio for many decades after their construction. But nevertheless, that Foucault embarks upon it at all, is in one of these examples of kind of the flexibilities of the logics that are dominating and that are available for speculators in this period. To continue this discussion of sort of, how some of the built environment can be somewhat surprising given both the criticism at the time and the types of forces and the types of images that speculators were working with and under. Much of my research concerns not only the production and the distribution, but also the consumption or the use of the built spaces that speculative real estate produced. And one of the key developments that resulted from this boom was the increased presence of corporations as owners of residential property across the city. And this map shows, at the turn of the century, this is a map of all corporately owned buildings in the city of Paris. It's about 2,500 of them at the time. I particularly studied the portfolio of one such company, the Compagnie Foncière de France, which was a crucial financial link in this machine of easy credit, fueling the property boom. And it found itself in possession of hundreds of apartment buildings when they were forced to repossess buildings after developers who had rented land from them were unable to finish their construction or went bankrupt, et cetera. So by using company reports, records of road openings and upgrading, municipal tax assessments to track the management of these buildings, we can track the management of these buildings and their uses over time and how they were adapted. Essentially, my interest here was in saying, what did a speculative landscape mean to the residents of the city? And this is just to give you a sense of the particular portfolio of the Compagnie Foncière that I examined. One of the key findings of this study of looking into what was actually produced and, of course, ultimately how it was used was that there's a surprising diversity of building types and of rent levels in the portfolio that Paris's speculative builders delivered. Buildings ranged from modest constructions, one apartment, one room apartments, maybe 6 or 7 on a floor multiplied across 6 stories, to the most elite format of apartment building, which would be 1 apartment per floor, again, multiplied across 5 or 6 stories. Most, of course, fell somewhere in between either of these 2 extremes. The floor plans themselves, if you had a chance to look at some of what I sent, are not surprising. There's no great architectural innovation coming out of this particular building period. But there are other sort of, I think interesting and important developments that are coming out of the sort of alignment of various amenities in the building. And you can particularly see this in terms of looking at the allocations that buildings had for domestic service. So one of the most uneven things that result from looking at this whole portfolio, and often some of this is sort of buildings that are side by side on the same street, is the unpredictability with which things like separate stairwells for servants, separate living quarters for servants were provided. Sometimes you would get a very wealthy building, 1 apartment per floor, high rents, and there would be no space for domestic servants. So people would have had a live-out servant, for instance. Other times, it simply became much more varied. And you can really read this as this moment of uncertainty about what the future kind of domestic service is going to be in these spaces. And in fact, what kind of neighborhoods these neighborhoods are going to be. Because they're very much neighborhoods in the making, particularly in the west end of the city. And you can read that in the sort of unevenness with which these sorts of services are distributed throughout the buildings. One of the most important findings, and I'm nearly at the end, concerned the use of concerned the use of these buildings over time. So by studying the tax records of, again, very closely this particular portfolio of buildings, revealed the importance of middle-class subletting throughout the Compagnie Foncière's entire portfolio. Sometimes this starts incrementally with one individual who leases a nearby apartment and then leases it out. That could then build. Occasionally one renter would end up taking over an entire building, and that could then develop into a professional hotel enterprise. And several of the Compagnie Foncière's buildings became hotels in the late 19th century. Few of them are still hotels today. And we can only speculate on the reasons. And here what I'm showing you is the tax status that records whether someone is in fact getting income from renting out a space within their own apartment, if you go sort of floor by floor through these buildings. And we can only speculate on the reasons that an individual would take in a subletter. We know several things from looking at this demographic that more women than men did so, for instance, so it may have been a respectable way for women to sort of get a little bit of extra income. We can also confirm that this was something that took place at rather sort of middling to high rent levels. So these were not in theory, the poorest people trying to make their rent, but they may have been people who found that as the management company continually increased their rental demands, which they started to do from the 1890s, they were forced to take on extra income and to use their space in this particular way. When you combine this subletting practice with the fact that the Compagnie Foncière placed throughout its portfolio numerous rental agencies, so they would transform an apartment into an agency or into a management office, what you can see is that these speculative developers are creating entire districts that become permeated by a consumer mobility and a commercial disposition towards space. However, and this is the final observation that I'll make on the landscapes of speculation, in other ways, the activities of real estate developers reaffirmed fixity rather than flux. And so if I can again flag back to that first development by Paul Foucault that I raised in the 11th arrondissement of the city, where he buys the public land, the vast majority of buyers of the completed buildings that the architects would, within the next few years, put on those properties, held on to their buildings for many years. So apartment buildings are purchased from a speculative developer. They then don't change hands. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, they change hands only with the death of the owner. So in this way, the innovations and the interventions of speculators are producing properties that behave in an entirely traditional fashion. This is one way, perhaps, that the agency of speculative developers and the sort of impact of speculative developers can in fact erase itself, because outside of this sort of mobilization of land and the financial mechanisms that go into the novelty of the financial mechanisms that go into this production, the spaces they produce in fact become quite ordinary quite quickly. And I've chosen this image to conclude with. I was going to come back to Paul Focio's sort of his great real estate seal, Paris, time is money. But I thought this one better communicated this notion of networks, of organization, of collaboration that the work of speculation requires, and that I wanted to draw attention to. That heavily invested developers develop multiple modes of boosterism. This is a lot of what I've been talking about as boosterism, is on one level, I think, unsurprising. However, it is important that we recognize the historically specific ways that their expectations were generated and their projections take shape. And of course, as I said at the outset, the work that this discourse performs. And I think we can see that really blatantly with, say, Focio's Montmartre development, about sort of, the way that one can play with some of the discourse around speculation to produce particular kinds of outcomes. By stressing their dependence on demand and the already existing socioeconomic geography of the city, speculators naturalize their interventions in the urban landscape, giving their material and their intellectual labor the appearance of common sense. And a certain kind of ambivalence regarding their own agency, I think, was and is an important component of establishing a market that appears to operate in a dispassionate and depersonalized manner, independent of the actions of any particular participant. The ways that developers narrated and quantified the spaces of the city both helped to construct these spaces in material form, but also in intellectual form. They were constructing the market in which they were operating, and which they then used to explain how they actually went about thinking about their productions. And I think it's diving into these worldviews and into these practices that give us a greater appreciation, greater purchase for the spaces of negotiation that are available in the construction of the modern city. And that is where I will end. And I hope that that kept somewhat to time, but maybe not.
Thank you so much, Alexia. I think it was a very considered lecture. And I appreciate that we all appreciate that you've made links to, trying to link other ideas in the series in a very nice manner. I know that
should I stop the share? Should I?
Yeah, maybe that's good.
Yeah.
Some of all of the our students have prepared some questions, not only based on the readings, but also probably some things have come up during the lecture too that they would like to engage you with. So they actually did do the readings. That is one of our things to basically, we always ask for these readings to basically help to give a little bit of context before a lecture. So I think Anna, you had something to start with? You're on mute.
Sorry. Hello?
Hello.
Hello, Alex.
Hey.
So thank you for the lecture, super inspiring. I have a question related maybe to the present also of Paris. As you know, Paris is experiencing a massive transformation due to the new master plans for the next Olympic Games. And in your text, you were saying that real estate has not gained popularity as a topic in urban studies, but I have a positive view. After my experience in Paris, these competitions have some specific characteristics. Normally, they are developed by the city of Paris and a developer like Novaxia or Bouygues. Then they need to involve designers under 30 in their teams. And they also involve these way of life consultants and bankers who know the market. So I have two questions. Which parameters of today's real estate speculation in Paris could be compared and contrasted with the period of your expertise? And could you elaborate more on how were trends in society analyzed in the period you study?
Rephrase the second one again for me. Trends in society.
Yeah. Trends in society, how they were analyzed in the period you study.
Yeah, that's going to be, Well, I think that what you've told me about the, the contemporary process sounds extremely interesting. I think in terms of how urban development, or let's just say development, because it's often about the process of transforming non-urban land into urban land, takes place today, either in Paris or either in France or elsewhere, I think doesn't bear a lot of comparison with the types of, there are some of the impulses and dispositions, and I could talk more at length about that, about sort of how we view land, that I think do have, are terrifically enduring and repetitive. They come back even if they seem like they don't come back. But I think in terms of the sort of the place that private development is allowed to occupy, I don't think it has anything, in the French context in particular, anything like the free hand that it had in the period that I study. And that was something of what attracted me to this period. And it's also a shortcoming of my research, in fact, because I was very razor-eyed focused on, everything that is talked about in the French context, if you're a historian of France, is about the state and centralization. And this is why we talk so much about, say, housemanization. So I was focused like a laser on, I'm going to forget that the state exists for a while, and I'm going to only look, and I'm going to try to tell this story from kind of the bottom up of these kind of who's training who, how are they getting land, where is the money coming from? And of course, you can't do that, because just like the state involves everything else, you also need to bring the state in. But it's true that at the end of the 19th century was this, it was a real kind of, they had, as I said, just made the formation of these particular companies, much, much easier. There was a real sense, and it was a transformative sense, I think, amongst architects themselves, of sort of how the opportunities for what they could do in the urban environment were opening. Of course, there was a lot less regulation. There was still a lot of regulation, but a lot less. But I think, the notion of what you put up there, that there's sort of like they need to consult with someone who's under 30. I think I would like to take that away and think much more about sort of how the process over time has begun to reckon much more structurally with the idea that there are some kinds of sort of real needs out there that need to be part of the planning process, right? So I think, the notion of participatory planning, which I think is, a little bit démodé now. I think that there's probably a through line to be drawn there, but it would be very alien to the kinds of impulses that the people that I'm looking at in this particular period study. But that's exactly why we should put them together, right? I'm not capable of doing it exactly right now, of putting them together in the most productive way. But if I were to spend a little bit more time thinking about it, I think we'd get a really interesting through line there. The second one about how people were analyzing society at the time. Again, did you also sort of mean that maybe comparatively, sort of how it's different from today? I gestured towards this a tiny bit by saying about the particular place that the housing question was coming to occupy, and did really occupy sort of the municipal councillors, for instance, in the late 19th century. So the notion of like, how do we solve the problems that are confronting the working class, and what will become loosely in the run-up until the First World War known as la vie chère. So there's a real kind of a sense of like, life is getting too expensive. And it's not exclusively for the poorest members of society, but it obviously hits them the hardest. So I would say that the sort of categories of analysis that dominated how people were understanding society at the time, and the needs that an architect should be responding to, were primarily around the needs of class and of social peace. Sort of, a kind of working class uplift, a kind of, and then which filters very much into this, kind of an international discourse about hygiene, and sort of how, the built spaces that can be generated by those in charge of residential construction can be a component of kind of solving these broader social questions. I would say that would be the dominant one. Of course, there's tons of things tied up with gender around that, because obviously these are spaces that are understood as to be kind of inculcating a particular kind of domestic relationship. But I think I'll probably stop there and say that that's the most important one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Go on? Hi, Jin, and I found what you started out with kind of like a really interesting. I'd never heard of this, but that how the rent is in contradiction with the laws of supply and demand. So I was living and working in Oakland before this, which has obviously the Bay Area has seen an insane amount of investment since the tech boom. And there's always this discussion about housing and the homelessness that exists there and how to address it. We need to build more housing. Is that not the solution?
No. I mean, yeah, I think obviously you've put your finger right on the sort of heart of this, right? People, there's different sides about how we do this, right? How do we solve the kind of the crisis of affordability? Clearly, it has to be that if things are too high, it's because things are too scarce. And I think and maybe this is another way that, you know, I could trace some kinds of continuities with kind of material I'm looking at. There's so much else that I mean, and you'll get other people, by the way, on this in your series who are going to say much smarter things. So, you know, pay attention to them and not to me as a historian. But there's so much else that is going in to what makes up the price that someone needs to get out of that building. That the notion that sort of simply sort of more and more of it will automatically bring a price down. It's just, you know, I think, again, it's another thing that pushes us towards, and this kind of, you know, can be quite difficult to master as a discipline, really local studies. I wouldn't say that that's not that wouldn't work everywhere, but we could, you know, think back to, I believe it was in the run up to the 2008 housing crisis. I think Bernanke said something like, there's no real estate market bubble because there's no such thing as the real estate market, right? There's an infinite number of little real estate markets. They're extremely localized. So I think that, you know, it's possible that in some areas it would be, you know, a real solution. But I don't think it's sort of something that we should not take on and sort of really critically interrogate to be like, you know, well, what is actually going to go on here? And I think it is sometimes in the popular discourse, it's a little bit too simplified. And you know, I think hasn't been borne out historically. But again, I would say that you need to look at sort of each space if you were actually sort of trying to make a policy decision, which historians rarely are.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, Alexia. Thank you for the thorough lecture. Okay. One of the key aspects which I took out was that how the speculators naturalize their developments, right? And in the context of Paris, I believe the aesthetics also plays a crucial role, especially the facade. Yeah. And now I believe this goes hand in hand with the Beaux-Arts school and the way they educate their architects, right? And now here comes the questions or the interpretation of the utility of history, because now we are faced in contemporary, at least, I believe that there is a growing discrepancy between the educational sector or the aesthetic values that we are used to see in our schools and the real estate developments. So I would like you to comment on that, perhaps.
I mean, yeah, and of course, you know, again, there's a lot of complexity to what's going on. So most of these, some of the big architects that I look at, for instance, I'll just start small and then I'll get to your bigger point in my answer. You know, so Foucault himself is trained at this École des Beaux-Arts, for instance, and he leaves because I suppose I would love to know much more about his individual sort of motivations, but I don't know very much about him personally. I can only know what I can find sort of peripherally around him, but he leaves at quite a young age, and I think before he finishes, and he possibly just realized there was a lot of money to be made doing another kind of work, and he, you know, kind of sets out for himself. You know, so he is trained there, but the types of production, and this is why they also have to do things like Onassim Masselin has to write this guide to try to convince other architects to come and, you know, join the speculators. It's because there's what he does is seen as sort of an illegitimate route to professional life, and what they do architecturally is also seen as kind of an architecture de fabrique. That they're just they often use these terms like confectionner, like you're making a mass product, right? You're just turning out chunk after chunk after chunk, and you're in fact not using any of the kind of critical tools or adopting the particular and very important kind of professional stance that an architect has to adopt, which is to be the person who dictates taste to people, not responds to their imagined desires. And so, it's really a contradictory position. And nothing, that these guys produce when they do kind of their large developments. Focus does a couple small houses, which I do get some, or have some favorable reviews in architectural critic magazines, for instance. But nothing that they do is challenging to kind of the existing kind of simple aesthetics of the street, and nothing they do is innovative in terms of when you get to the beautiful Parisian buildings, of particularly a lot of the ones that I think we find most beautiful today actually come after 1902, because the regulations change and it allows for a much more, to come to your term, a much more expressive facade. They're allowed to have more decoration. They're allowed to have things that bump out more into the public roadway. They're allowed a little bit more height. And we get, sort of again, the street takes on even more variety after that point. So, the position that they occupy when they are doing their speculation is exactly the opposite of what the educational institutions at the time, and I'm sure I'm simplifying this narrative because it's important to my story, but it wasn't where I concentrated my research about sort of disjunctures in the architectural community itself. But specifically why they are not valued by their contemporaries is because they are kind of giving up their position of artistic authority. So today, where would you like your position of artistic authority to be? I do not know what the contemporary position is on, what the role of the architect is in terms of training, an individual to see and perform their lives in a different way. But I would say that the debate was already there, and it might be simply a debate that's fundamental to the production of the built environment under capitalism. When these are the sorts of choices that are confronting a professional who is uncomfortably placed between the commercial and the artistic, and the engineer, the technician, artistic, commercial, technician. That's probably the triad.
Thank you. Are there some more questions?
Hi there.
Hi.
It was striking the familiarity that Paris had in the late 1800s to my experiences of London and working in sort of around developers, say in the last 5 years, maybe not in a positive way. But I was wondering, you talked about these individuals having sort of several limited companies. And I was sort of wondering why they were organizing their business like this. Was it a matter of having separate brands where there was a different identity for each development? Was it a business organization thing with sources of capital, or was it a way of hiding your power across the city?
I think this notion that you just introduced here at the end, that notion of hiding your power across the city, is something I hadn't considered, but very possibly, especially because, again, I focus on him, though he's typical. He's an exceptional typical, this Paul Focchio character. I mean, they're not undertaking, several of these developers, the ones who are flipping into several companies, for instance, often at the same time going over. There's a very, they're not carrying out ethical business. I can say that. Focchio was bribing people left, right, and center. He bribed his way into getting, sort of the French decoration, the Légion d'honneur, It was this, it was quite a scandal. He received it, and then there's a controversy over the fact that he shouldn't have. He received it for a building that he didn't build, as part of the Belgian World's Fair that took place. He received credit for a pavilion that he didn't build, and he's constantly sort of attempting to influence people and get concessions for particular developments. So I think that it's probably worth me looking into some of these operations again from the perspective of, how much, so not only thinking that the way they talk about their developments is a way of effacing themselves, but, how much it's actually important for them politically and economically to efface themselves, right? If they become too prominent. And very few of us can think of, for the 19th century, sort of like quite famous real estate developers. It's not something that comes to our mind. We can think of, big iron works founders or the first car developers, but not real estate speculators. And I think it's worth thinking about the particular dangers to them of being too visible in that sector. But I will say, just most immediately, they found lots of these companies and refound another one and go to another one, because each time they get paid. So they bring, they come to another company and they manage to convince and issue small shares from that company, saying that, as a founder of this company, I should get 50,000 francs. And then they do it again at another one. So there's a real kind of material gain to be had there. But I think, and of course the mechanism itself is also useful for, it's how you can legally join together a bunch of different entrepreneurs. Normally you get your 7 or 8 or 9 people, and each of them represents a different trade that would go into the construction of a building. So, there's a brick worker, there's the plumbing guy is in there. The person who's going to be responsible for the decoration on the facade is in there, and you all combine. And then of course there's legal benefits to being in this forum as well, right? You're limited in how much you can lose when you go ahead and you kind of form this particular kind of corporation. But I think that, I like thinking more about the secrecy aspect that you brought up, because I think it helps to, one of the dangers of doing this kind of work is that sometimes you seem like you are, you risk kind of lionizing people who were quite self-interested, and who often worked very hard to achieve whatever they wanted outside of any kind of sense of, public regulation or the public good. So highlighting that kind of notion of kind of secrecy can help keep that in the fore, I think, as opposed to letting it slide to the background while you're so impressed with these people just putting up hundreds of buildings in the space of 2 years,
Great. On that note, or Ludo, do you have a question or any concluding thought?
Well, maybe a last short question in relation, or maybe it's not so sure the answer, sorry for that, Dan, but is the relation more towards, let's say, other countries? And our students have been doing now a seminar with Jean-Louis Cohen on, let's say, the idea of little Parises outside of outside of the world, let's say in other parts of the world. And I wonder how in this sense, the Parisian context was indeed very probably a kind of forefront of a discipline, and how that, for example, relates to, let's say, the American practice that, like, for example, one of the ideas I heard was very much the kind of real estate trust that was obviously invented in the 1960s by Eisenhower's legislation in the US. And I wonder how the Parisian context perhaps gave rise to those other examples.
Yeah, I would say that in some ways it's limited and in some ways it's important. So most of the, so when we talk about the little Parises that are everywhere, quite often we're also talking about sort of how Haussmann's model moves. And Haussmann's model is not quite what we tend to think about if we think about it kind of just in passing. It's a little bit more complicated, and it's not as omnipowerful even in Paris as historians, I think, often think of it. So I would say that so often when those models are moving, what we're talking about is kind of a model, I suppose, of it's the monumental boulevard. It's isolating a particular monument. Those sorts of practices, I think, are more contributing. Though it would be interesting to look even at your little Parises, which go everywhere. And Haussmann himself went to many other places to try to, he goes to Istanbul, he goes to Cairo, to sort of talk to them as an expert in how their cities should look. but it would be interesting to sort of also take those from, less from kind of the state planning angle and more from the private development and the financial angle, and see, sort of where some of those similarities are. I think the American story itself, in particular, is again, I'm a historian. All of them are different, right? The land markets in England are very different from the way land can function in civil law countries, and France being one of the most important ones. Kind of the extent of your property rights, et cetera. It's a deeply national area of specificity. The American case has a deeper history of real estate investment trusts, even than the sort of the post-war kind of the formalization of the rights as we know them today. There is a deeper history. There's a historian named Elizabeth Blackmar who does great work on this, sort of on how these began coming about in the 19th century, particularly in sort of like Boston. This is like Brahmin wealth is going into places to be protected for the families. And of course, and the long-term development of the mortgage market there is very different as well. So I think that I would always urge us to do what I think is sadly just very detailed and long work in each particular setting to see what are these kinds of structures, what are these kinds of mechanisms, what are the politics in each place, and just never to take them for granted. So from a certain perspective, I think just saying like, oh, there's an easy way that I could try to make my research like sound super relevant and be like, oh, look, this is just like the subprime mortgage crisis, and this how they're writing off their collateralized debt over here, and it sounds this totally explains Arizona in 2008. Sorry to bring up Arizona today. And we're all waiting, and it's true, half of the time, and the other half of the time, in fact, what people are trying to achieve with each of these things are very different. So it all does depend on the kind of story you want to tell. If you want to talk about kind of the difficulties, the negotiations, and the complexities of what goes into making the particular sort of from the land up until the building, built and social spaces in a particular place work the way they do, versus if you want to take the bigger view and say, how much of this can we trace, across? I don't think you'll find many straight genealogies from that perspective from France, but that doesn't mean you won't find some more, particularly, again, from the 1960s onwards from America outwards. I think you'll probably trace more kind of straightforward transportations and transfers of ideas in that perspective. Yes, I know, as you said this is not a short answer, but of course, none of my answers are short.
Great. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Alexia, for outlining this Parisian story, and also for making the, it was very nice also to transpose some of these ideas for an architecture and urban design audience. So that's very much appreciated. So thank you for your intellectual camaraderie in that.
Thank you.
And have a good afternoon. And we look forward to engaging with each other in some other moments. So, and thank you for the wonderful book, which you should be commended on, which I presume is the output of your PhD. So the first of many books. So, but thank you for putting that into the world. A very interesting piece.
Thank you.
So thank you.